Can rock and
Good
roll.
to go. Good to go. Thank you so much. And so thanks everyone for being punctual and joining. Welcome to the webinar. Thanks for spending some time with us today. We are discussing our latest research, which is Emerging Futures 4. I'm Rachel MacSween. I'm the Director of Partnerships and Stakeholder Engagement in the UK for IDP, coming at you live from Glasgow. And I'm joined today by Elle Butler, and Elle and I are sharing presenting duties, and she'll introduce herself more formally later on. So for those of you in the USA and for Canada particularly, but also plenty of people in the United Kingdom have never been to Glasgow, I thought I'd give you a couple of interesting facts about Glasgow before we start. In 2022, Time Out voted Glasgow the friendliest city in the world and the fourth best city in the world overall, thanks to casual kindness and good humour. And in 2008, my second Glasgow fact is it was voted a UNESCO City of Music, with over 130 concerts happening every week in the city. So my tourism bit is over. I think it's just useful for you to know where I am. I'd love to know where you're all coming in from. So pop that in the chat as well if you get a chance. But let's get on with our research, what we're here for. So I think it's useful in the first slide, what we'll do is we'll take a bit of a step back and look at where we've come from on our research journey. Emma, if you can click that slide onto the timeline. Fantastic, thank you. So if you cast your minds back to the olden days of COVID, we started this research project under the guise of Crossroads 1. And at the time, Crossroads in April 2020 was really just a chance for us to take a pulse on our students and what they were thinking during that crazy time. So we ran 5 of those Crossroads surveys, and we found that our partners, you on the call and many others, were really interested in what the students were saying. That then became New Horizons as we sort of emerged from the pandemic. I don't think post-pandemic is still really a thing, but when we were emerging out of the worst of it, New Horizons was our research tool, and we've now come into Emerging Futures, and we're on to Emerging Futures 4, miraculously. What's been particularly great about Emerging Futures 4 as we've gone through the data is that we've now got that longitudinal lens and view on student sentiment and student choice. So our survey students have been telling us now for 3.5 years what they think, and we're able to look back and see how that perception of students and the perception of destinations has changed over those 3.5 years. So before we get into the details, it's quite useful to look at the methodology, like how do we do this? So we conduct a 15-minute interview we survey students for 15 minutes, and that's prospective students, students who've already applied, current students, and completed students. And for the first time in Emerging Futures, we've also surveyed parents, which has been really insightful. We'll come on to that slightly later. It was in the field from July and August before coming back into what we call our IQ team, our kind of intelligence team, and various colleagues across the business spent weeks analysing the data, quality assuring the data, and that's where we've got to today, and some of those insights we're going to present. So huge thank you to the IQ team and everyone involved with Emerging Futures on our side. It's a huge undertaking, but one we think we get really valuable insights out of. Who responds to the survey? So we had 10,000 survey respondents this year, and that's a mix from across the globe. Over 98 countries are represented here. And you can see the mix in the first pie chart of what stage in the student journey those applicants and students are at. So about 4/5 are pre-enrollment, and about 1/5 are enrolled in institutions or they have already completed their studies. More than half respondents are postgraduate level, with 1/4 being undergraduate, and the rest are a mix of pathway, vocational, and other, which includes English language. The largest market of respondents, perhaps unsurprisingly, given IDP's footprint, is India, but great and significant representation from other key recruitment markets as well. And as I mentioned, we have the parents responder profile. So this is the first time in Emerging Futures we've asked parents what they thought. That's the final piece of context. We had respondents from 38 countries, with China and India, the Chinese and Indian parents rather leading the way. And you can see on the slide there a breakdown of how many children they have. So 50% of respondents had 2 children. You know, almost 1/4 had 1 child, but then the aging of the parents as well, which is important when we think later about how we are communicating with that really important group of customers. Okay, let's go on with the show. So the first one that I really want to dive in on is destinations as first choice. So where are our students choosing as their first choice of study destinations? That's not to say that the students will necessarily go to those destinations. And I think that's important to point out. It's like, this is where they want to go, and this is where they're ranking as their first choice out of everywhere that we recruit to in IDP. So for the first time, Australia joins Canada as the most desired destination. That's the first time during our Emerging Futures surveys. This has changed over time, and we'll come on to that in just a second. And we're seeing the UK now in 3rd place, and the USA in 4th, New Zealand in 5th, and then Ireland in 6th place. I'd like to point out, particularly for the benefit of any of our US colleagues that are on the call, this is IDP survey respondents only. We know that the USA remains the most popular international study destination for students. There's almost 1.1 million students studying in the US at the moment at the fantastic institutions there. But in our own survey and with our students, the USA is 4th choice. And we can go into some data later to suggest why that might be happening. So then we might take a look at what the first choices are over time. And that's what I said at the start. We've got that longitudinal lens now. We can see what we used to ask students and what they were answering, and now what we're asking the same question and what they're answering and how that's changed. So this, if you look at each stack colour as being the 4 different emerging futures. So column 1 for Canada, 26%. In emerging futures 1, 26% of students said that Canada was their first choice. That's now 25%. In emerging futures 1, 19% said Australia was their first choice. But think of the timing. When we were doing emerging futures, Australia was still pretty closed borders. 25% of students are now saying that that's their first choice. And in the UK, the good news for the UK is that it's gone up. 19% of students were saying in 2022 that it was their first choice. Now we've got 22%. But the USA is declined. So it was 20% and now it's 19%. New Zealand and Ireland remaining relatively flat, but albeit off a lower base. But the news, the headline there is that Canada dips out of the immediate first choice and the obvious first choice rather. And for the last few cycles, that has been the cycles of the research, Canada has been by far the first choice. I think what we're seeing there, and we're seeing this pull through in our enrollment data and our application data and our kind of lead data for future cycles, is that comeback that we all feared Australia would do. They're doing it really well. And the perception of Australia is that great, open for business, and we've got a lot of good qualities and good attributes and good, what's the right expression, the right pull factors. And we'll come on to some of those pull factors in just a second. Primary factors in first choice. This is probably not surprising for everyone on the call, but the high quality of education remains the #1 driver of choice. So when students are looking at those destinations and saying, why would I go there? 62% are saying it's because of the high quality of education. And that's particularly true for the USA and the UK. We know that the high quality of education is what we win on, and we'll come on to that in just a second at the moment. So why are you choosing your first choice? We get that that's your first choice. Why are you choosing it? Quality of education, good employment opportunities after graduation. That's the second highest factor. Safety. We'll come on to that in a second with the parents as well. Supporting international students is also incredibly important. The 4th reason, institutions are attractive, but they mean the courses and the offering that institutions have, and welcomes students or people from other countries. And it's really interesting then when you look at those 6 factors and you look at them from a destination lens. So on the next slide, we're looking at, say, Canada there on the top line. The 3 most important reasons why a student would choose Canada: high quality education, safety of the country, and they welcome people from other countries. And we see that ourselves when we look at the language that Canada use around students coming to study. They're new Canadians, they're taking their family with them, they're very deliberately welcomed as part of a future workforce. Whereas some of the impression that people will get coming to the UK in particular, some of the language is very negative: migration, migrants. It's not the friendly, welcoming language that Canada use, and perhaps that's why the UK scores lower on being welcoming for international students. So as I said before, the #1 driver for UK there, 70% of students choosing the UK are saying we're choosing that because of the high quality education that's here. And as I said, quite depressingly, the lowest one there is the welcoming. So where it's 33% of respondents said the UK is a welcoming, or they're choosing it because the UK is a welcoming location or destination, not helped by the current UK government. This really backs up the research from previous slides, which looks at the main factors of choice for the USA and the fact that quality of education is the main reason why students will choose USA. What I find interesting here, thanks Emma, is the high percentage for graduate employment opportunities is why students are choosing the US, when actually we know that the optional practical training is probably the least appealing in terms of length of study, and that was mentioned at the start, and also the reality of getting that can actually be very different from maybe the perception. But this is about perceptions and not about reality. So students are using their perceptions of the US and the ability to work there as a driving force for going. Whether that pulls through in reality is a different matter. And Australia, they are scoring the highest on quality and safety. The one I would draw attention to here is Ireland, and for any Irish colleagues on the call, we haven't really got any indicators that are way out front, which suggests that maybe raising awareness and promotion of the kind of salient points of study and the benefits of study in Ireland is something that we could really focus on with you in your marketing messages. So the next slide looks at why your second choice wasn't your first choice. So we've asked students obviously to rank their destinations and preference. So why was the person that they chose second, or the destination they chose second, not first? And 3 out of the 5 reasons that they gave were to do with money and finances. Cost of living is too expensive, the cost of tuition is too high, and the accommodation is, when they get there, is too expensive as well. We've got some questions shortly on cost of living, and we'll look at the impact that that's having more broadly on some student choices, particularly to do with the way that they study. The other 2 aspects that it didn't have, or that the second choices didn't have as much of, was friends and family in that destination. And we know that friends and family can be a critical decision maker, particularly when we look at where students will stay when they come to university, but also the difficulty, or the perceived difficulty, in receiving a visa was a reason that the second choice was the second choice and not the first choice. So we'll finish this section on the perceptions of study destinations overall. So these flags indicate whether the overall perception of a destination has gone up or gone down or stayed static since Emerging Futures 3. So we pulled out just a couple here, and I would like to flag actually, and we'll go through this at the end, but as core partners, you have access to this in dashboards, which are in your My IDP Connect. The dashboards will be live tomorrow, and you can examine this data and cut this data in a million different ways. And there's lots of different things that sit within each section. Ellie and I are really just skirting over the top issues at the moment, but you can go in and look at this from an individual destination level and see where you're winning or where perhaps you might be losing ground to competitor destinations. So core partners live tomorrow on the Emerging Futures 4 dashboards. Great news. Thanks again, IQ team, for getting that live. What we looked at here is quality of education. So how are the students perceiving the quality of education in the US compared to Emerging Futures 3? They're perceiving it to be lower than the students that were surveyed for Emerging Futures 3 were. Australia has gained ground, and Canada has also lost ground. Value for money, everybody's down from a perceptions perspective, and that is directly linked to cost of living. So value for money and the ability to afford it are obviously hand in hand, and we'll come on to affordability in just a second. Quality of, as I said, quality of education covered there, value for money. The next slide looking at graduate employment opportunities. So again, interesting that the USA has perceived better for graduate employment opportunities. That could be the 2-year extension with STEM to the OPT, the optional practical training. That's not new, so it's interesting that that's being perceived to be a higher pull factor. Australia is improving its graduate employment opportunity perception. But interestingly there, Canada has declined. And we've always seen Canada as somewhere that students want to go and study because of the post-study work opportunities. But the perception is that maybe that's not as straightforward as it used to be. So isn't that an interesting difference between Emerging Futures 3 and Emerging Futures 4? And linked to that, obviously, post-study work visa policies directly linked to the graduate opportunities. Australia seen as pulling out ahead, no doubt in light of the fact they've announced extra measures for post-study work for students studying all degrees, but specifically degrees where there are skill shortages in Australia, and the UK has remained flat for that. So just to summarise that section before I move on to learning preferences, we've got oh, sorry, there's one more. I get carried away and I can't see the next slide, so I have to just go on instinct. The overall perceptions of study destinations here are that the USA is seen as the most favourable study destination, when we've asked students, the mix there is that 40% of them say that they perceive the USA to be that they perceive it highly, they perceive it well. 43% are saying it's medium, and there's only 17% of students that say they don't perceive the USA to be that attractive for them as a study destination. That mix changes. So it starts with the USA perception is high, Australia not that far behind, Canada just behind Australia, Ireland and the UK even, but then the mix within how well a student perceives the country is 50% of students going to Ireland perceive it to be a great study destination. In the UK, it's just 26% of students think that it's they perceive it to be high positively. So an interesting mix there, and one that you can absolutely dive into when you've got your dashboard access tomorrow. So just in summary there, key points, what can we take away about student choice? Perceptions of factors important to students continue to change. That's kind of obvious. Destination countries cannot rely on previous reputation. That is changing all the time, and we have to keep on top of that, otherwise we see decline. And the primary factor in first choice for students is still high quality education, but good graduate opportunities and feeling welcome and safe are important as well. And what we try to do after each section is look at the key actions, and we've got some for government and policymakers, but some we don't have. For those, we've just got for institutions. But taking into consideration all factors in attracting international students, students want more than a great education. They want a highly ranked institution, they want future career prospects, and they want affordable accommodation. I mean, they want a lot, but they are paying a lot of money, so I don't see why we wouldn't want to meet them in this space from a policy perspective. Similarly, institutions ensuring messaging to students covers a well-rounded opportunity for them when they're there, including, and but not limited to, quality of education, graduate opportunities, as well as safety. I've got 3 more minutes to finish 2 sections, so I'm going to go a bit quicker because Ellie has got really interesting things to say. Learning preferences here. So we've looked at where the students want to study. We want to think about how they study when they're there. So this has been a really interesting shift. The headline here is there's a decline, 10% decline in the number of students wanting on-campus study experiences, and an increase in students wanting accredited learning in their home country. So this obviously speaks to quite a lot of the TNE opportunities that the UK government are putting forward as part of the international education strategy. We see Australia is going hard in TNE, and we know that a lot of partners in the USA and Canada are looking at TNE as being a lead driver of what they're trying to do. So overseas in-person on-campus study preferences have declined by 10%. Just a small difference in people starting online in their home country and then completing their studies overseas. That's 1% fewer. But I think the really interesting one there is that third column, that blue one, local campus-based study in your home country with an accredited partner and from an international institution. Why are students wanting to do that? That's the next question we asked them. It's the ability to pay lower fees. So we know that they're paying less money to go to in their home country. They obviously don't have to consider as high living expenses, and generally tuition fees at accredited partners tend to be a bit cheaper. The ability to use qualifications as a pathway to migration. That's a really interesting one because that's not the case for most destinations. You can't do a degree in your home country and then use that as a migration route. Although Australia have introduced something recently called the mechanism for the mutual recognition of qualifications, specifically between Australia and India. And that's looking at how Australia recognise school, higher and vocational education and VET qualifications to use as pathways to advanced pathways to education, but also pathways into the workforce as well. So maybe that's specifically responding to the mutual recognition of qualifications, but for other destinations, that's not quite as straightforward. Why they're doing it, access to post-study work rights. Again, we think we need some education there because you can't access post-study work in a destination country if you haven't studied there. They like the fact there's a designated study hub, and that probably is why they want to, the option for studying online remains flat because they do want to go and study somewhere, and the study hubs that some of the TNE partners that we have offer allow them to do that. And the fifth thing there is the ability to study at a higher ranked institution than would be possible if they went overseas. So the perception there that it's easier to get into a university through TNE than it is through on-campus experience. And the summary on that slide, it's not too much different to what I just said. 10% decline in students considering in-person overseas study. Other options like local campus-based study is important. So the key actions here are consider how do we, or can we, could we, should we look at how we work with government to consider students who are studying locally at branch campuses if they still want some of the perks included with post-study work rights. That seems a leap for some countries that we work in, but perhaps that's something we have to work on influencing. And the takeaway for institutions is look at how the TNE or branch campus offerings are promoted alongside your on-campus offerings. So people are considering both. How do you make sure that you don't lose out if somebody decides they can't come to you on campus, but they're not aware of your TNE options? How do you make sure they are aware of those so you don't lose out to competitors or people that have got a longer presence in the market? And my final section is on cost of living. So many economies, as we know, are feeling the squeeze at the moment. And what impact is that having on the students' perceptions of being able to afford to study abroad and the cost of living when they get there? So the question we asked them was, have the recent increases in cost of living made you reassess studying overseas? And more than half, so 56%, have said they're reassessing their studying overseas due to the increased cost of living. There are small differences here in each of the destinations, but roughly half of the students who are choosing your study destination, our study destination, are having to rethink that because of affordability, more so than normal. And that's really interesting then when you get into the destination perceptions of cost of living. So on the next slide, we asked how they perceived each of the study destinations alongside each other from a cost of living perspective. The US came out as the perceived most expensive place to study, quickly followed by the UK. Australia was perceived as the third most expensive place, with Canada, New Zealand, and Ireland looking more affordable. So if you disagree with that, if you don't think that you've got a higher cost of living than Australia or the UK or vice versa, what can we do in our messaging to make sure that students understand that the cost of living is affordable, or is it affordable? Do we want to make sure we're explicit about whether we think students can or can't afford it? But nevertheless, this is the perceptions. The USA is perceived to be the most expensive study destination from both a tuition fee perspective and a living expenses perspective. The final part on this is the cost of living considerations. So we ask students, how knowledgeable are you about the amount that you would need when you're living overseas? So how much are you aware of how much it's going to cost you when you get there? I don't love that 57% said they had some knowledge of that. The consideration here is the impact that will have on your student support teams and your student finance teams if students realise on arrival that they don't have enough money for fees and food and just generally surviving day to day. The more power to the 29% that feel highly informed. I think that makes me feel a bit better. But I do have to say I love the confidence of youth. Although I have some knowledge, it'll be totally fine. So if you look at the green chart, 68% are saying they're confident they'll have enough money to live on. They have some knowledge of how expensive it is, but nevertheless, they're confident they're going to have enough money to live on. And the 32% that don't feel that they're going to have enough money to live on are something we might want to think about from a marketing message perspective. So the cost of living increases, and I'm finishing on this slide, are how is that then driving student behaviour around finding part-time work? 68% of students expect assistance from you as institutions in finding part-time work during their studies. So we know that students it's a really delicate balance, because actually we're selling education and we're selling a study experience, but we have to be realistic that students are going to need to work part-time when they're there. So while we wouldn't necessarily promote that in our marketing materials because we want to be seen as a genuine study choice for students, we have to be very sort of realistic that students are going to want to get that help when they arrive. 68% of them expect to find that. And the main reasons for not working part-time, they're still looking, it's hard to find work, or they're finishing their course is more important to them. So the 16% that say finishing their course is more important to them warms my heart. So in summary on cost of living, before I hand over to Ellie, percentage of students indicating that they're reconsidering studying overseas has increased. That's quite drastically. The US has picked the UK as being the most perceived highest cost of living. And as we saw before, students are reconsidering studying overseas and will choose a branch campus instead. So the actions we've got here for the government: consider the impact of domestic fee policies on international fees. Are the international fees being driven up because domestic fees are being held? And institutions, there's a confidence that students will have enough to live on, but that's not matched by high knowledge. So what can we do in our communications to help them bridge that gap? I'll take a breath, I'll hand to Ellie, and I'll come back at the end for questions. Thank you, Ellie.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Rachel. And thanks everyone for joining us today. My name is Elle Butler and I'm head of marketing for North America. And I am coming to you live today from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So since Rachel shared some fun facts about Glasgow, I'll share quick ones about Philadelphia. So we have Einstein's brain located here in Philly. Albert Einstein's brain is preserved in the Mutter Museum, which is a super fascinating museum of medical oddities. If you ever get the chance to visit Philly, I recommend checking it out. Definitely something you won't forget. And the second fun fact about Philadelphia is we are the greatest sports city in America. And this is actually an objective, unbiased fact. So despite anything you've heard and despite our big heartbreak last night, if you follow baseball, we are the greatest sports city in America. So on that note, I'm going to dive into our section on accommodation. International student accommodation is obviously a very hot topic in many destination countries with housing shortages, cost of living crisis. So we wanted to gauge student attitudes on their accommodation. So we began here with a question where the results really, quite frankly, surprised me. So we asked students about their plans to secure accommodation, whether they're going to arrange accommodation before they arrive in their destination country or after they arrive. And the reason this surprises me is that lots of students actually say they want to wait until they arrive in their destination country to secure their accommodation. So the top half of results here on this slide are those who want to secure upon arrival, and the bottom half are students who want to have that arranged before they arrive in the destination country. So we can see globally, which is the last bar over on the right of this slide, that 44% of students want to secure accommodation upon arrival so that they can actually check out the environment first, do some inspections, maybe tour a couple different properties. And for Canada in particular, we see that over half of students say that they'll travel without their accommodation arranged, and they'll secure it after they arrive. And then that's followed by Australia, where 49% of students plan to do the same. So something interesting for institutions to consider as they're communicating to students about housing. About half of them are showing up without their housing secured yet. On our next slide, we then asked students who have already begun their studies, how satisfied are you with the accommodation that's been provided by your institution? So the students were able to rank their satisfaction here on a scale from 1 to 10. So we can see over on the left that the UK count came out on top for students who are most satisfied with their accommodation, followed by the US, Canada, and then Australia. But interestingly here for Canada, when we look at the subcategories within it, we see that Canada has both the highest percentage of very satisfied students at 40%, and simultaneously the highest percentage of least satisfied students at 21%. So students in Canada have quite strong feelings on their accommodation. They're either quite happy or they're very frustrated. So something for Canadian institutions to consider. We next took a look at students who indicated that they were staying in private accommodation, and we asked them, which of the following situations did you experience when looking for private accommodation? So we can see over here on the left that 33% of students say they rented a place close to campus for more than they budgeted. 32% of students say they rented a place far from campus for a more affordable rate. 27% say they settled for a property below their desired living requirements. And 25% of students say they inspected and applied to multiple different properties. So clearly students are putting a lot of time and energy into this process, and they're unfortunately still having to settle or pay more for accommodation than they planned to. And then finally here for our section on accommodation, we asked students if their ability to find accommodation met their overall expectations. So globally, 45% of students said the process met their expectations, but 25% said less than expected for their satisfaction, and 12% said much less than expected. Interestingly, within these results, not pictured on this slide, the US actually fared the best, with the highest proportion of students indicating that their ability to secure accommodation greatly exceeded their expectations and that they were highly satisfied. So some success there for the US. So overall, what insights can we take away here from the accommodation section? Well, there is often a disparity between intended accommodation plans and final accommodation situations. So a lot of students having to settle or pay more than they'd like to. The US and the UK have the top satisfaction rates from students for accommodation provided by institutions. And students who are renting privately have experienced budgeting issues, whether that's renting farther away to save money or paying more money to be close to campus. And some key actions takeaways for institutions here are to ensure that students have the support and the proper information they need regarding housing options, especially costs, and ensure that this information is available to students both before they arrive and then after they arrive on campus. So reiterating this information once they've already arrived, because as we've seen, a lot of students haven't yet secured their accommodation by that point. And next up, we'll dive into our brand new section on AI. I am particularly excited by this section because we've never asked students questions before on AI, and it's obviously a very hot topic in the sector right now. So we will dive in and take a look. And first, we ask students if they have used or if they intend to use AI to apply, to select an institution, and to select a subject or program. And we've broken out our responses here on this slide by global total, China, and India, because we see some really interesting things emerge in these markets. So the first, as we can see here on the slide, is that the percentage of Chinese students who plan to or have used AI to help them apply to overseas institutions is nearly double the average at 73%. Excuse me. In addition, 75% of Chinese students are also planning to let AI help them decide which institution to study at, while 74% of Chinese students plan to allow AI to help them choose which subject to study. Now, interestingly, in these cases, we see that India's responses are actually lower than the global total across the board. So quite different plans to use AI from China to India, as we can see. Taking a look at our next slide, we then ask students, do you expect that institutions will use AI to assess all or part of your application? And on the left here, we have the global total. And on the right here, we've again pulled out the China responses. So globally, 41% of students say yes, they expect that institutions will be using AI. But a third of students do not expect institutions to use AI to assess their application at all. And then we can see over on the right, again, Chinese students are more likely to expect that institutions will use AI to assess part of their application, with 67% saying yes. We also asked students, how likely are you to apply to an institution in the following situations? And the first situation here on the left is if the institution is using AI to assess applications. While the second situation on the right is if the institution is using AI to make an assessment of your application, but the final decision is made by a member of staff, so a real human. And what we saw is that students are more likely to apply if they know that the final decision is made by a member of staff. So they still want that human review of their application. On the left, we see that 24% of students say they are less likely to apply if they know that an institution is going to use AI to assess their application without a review by a member of staff. So this raises some important questions around how institutions are communicating about their admissions review process in the future, how they are incorporating AI, and the transparency around this process to students. We next asked students for their opinion on whether AI could make the application process fairer or if it might discriminate against certain students. And we have the global total over here on the left of the slide, where we can see that over a third of students believe that AI may discriminate against certain types of students when determining their suitability for the course. But over here on the right, again, when we look at Chinese respondents only, we see that Chinese students are much more likely to believe that AI could make the process fairer for all. We then see that students from the Philippines and India are more likely to say that the process might discriminate against certain types of students. So we're really seeing some mixed feelings here across the board when looking at different source countries and their views towards AI. We next wanted to consider the fact that AI is amazing and truly transformative technology, but we wanted to ask students where it cannot replace the value of human interaction in their application process. So we asked students, at what point in your journey is it most important to have human advice? And we can see that the number one answer that students gave over here on the left is the application phase. So actually making the application to the institution. And whether that's with the assistance of a trained counselor at IDP or with the assistance of an admissions counselor from your institution, students really want a human touch point at that time in the process. Students also indicated that human interaction is valuable when shortlisting institutions and when selecting their final institution. And then in last place, we see that the initial online research, not as important for the human touch point there, because students tend to do this more independently on their own. We then asked students, what is most important to you when making your application to an institution? And we asked students to select from the following options. So we see over on the left in first place here, students are saying that it's important to them that they receive a decision quickly based solely on their past grades and or their predicted grades, followed by, in second place, that I receive a slower decision that I know has been read and assessed by a member of admissions staff at the institution. So again, that importance of a human touch point. And then that in third place, that I receive a slower decision, but it takes into account my work experience, volunteer activities, or aspects of why I want to study the specific course or program. So again, a lot of students here indicating that they want a human involved in the process, in the assessment of their application, but a lot of students also indicating that they want this decision made very quickly. And this will lead us nicely into our next section on admissions, which we'll dive into right after this summary on AI. So here on AI, globally, we're seeing a significant number of students are intending to or have used AI to help them in their research and application process. Students from China are nearly twice as likely to use AI in their application process. And a third of students believe that using AI in admissions processing could make the process fairer for all, but nearly the same amount believe that it could discriminate against certain students. So important for institutions to keep in mind. So some key actions there for institutions are that it's really important to be having these conversations internally about how we ensure transparency to students about their application process and how students' data is processed and how these decisions are being made overall, and to take into consideration how you might incorporate AI into your application and review admissions processes in a way that will be fairer to students and will be transparent to them. And next up, as I mentioned, we're going to take a quick dive into admissions here. And one major takeaway that we saw, and perhaps no surprise, is that speedy application turnaround times continue to be expected by students. So 61% of students would like to receive their decision within 4 weeks of submitting their application, and 67% say that they'll reconsider their top choice of institution if they don't hear back within 4 weeks. So students really want that instant gratification. They want to hear from you as soon as possible after they submit the application. We also asked students how satisfied they are with the admissions process overall, and then we looked at these results by destination country. And here we can see that the UK and Canada came out on top for most satisfied students with the application process, and they're tied at 7.9 out of 10. And then this is followed by Australia, the US, and then New Zealand. So what insights can we take away here from this brief section on admissions? Well, obviously, application processing and efficiency continues to be a key driver in student decision making. So a key action for institutions here is to remember that there is a significant increase in likelihood of students to switch their top choice institution if the decision process goes longer than 4 weeks. So swift action is really still a key recommendation for admissions teams. Next, we're going to take a dive into post-study work, critical for a lot of international students. So in this section, we saw that the availability of employment routes after graduation is still a driving influence in choosing a study destination. So over here on the left, we see that 69% of students say they will apply for a post-study work visa. In the middle, we see 64% of students say that the availability of a post-study work visa is the main or an influencing factor in where they choose to study. And close to half of students would consider changing their study destination if the duration of the post-study work visa was shortened. So that's quite a significant stat for destination countries and governments to keep in mind as they strive to attract more international students. The length of this visa is particularly important to international students. We then asked students, where do you get trusted information in regard to the latest post-study work rights in a destination country? And as you can see here over on the left, 53% of students indicated that destination government websites are the most important place to get trusted information about post-study work rights. But this is closely followed by an institution website. So it's important to note that students are looking for this information on your website. So you want to make sure that it's easily accessible to them and that it is up to date. And then we want to take a look on the next slide. Thank you, Emma, at the key takeaways for this section on post-study work. So nearly 2/3 of students say the availability of a post-study work visa influenced where they chose to study. So this is obviously incredibly important to students. Nearly half of students would consider changing their study destination if the duration of that visa is shortened. And students are relying on government and institutional websites for the most up-to-date information on post-study work visa. So here we have some key actions, both for governments and policymakers and for institutions. So for governments, it's critical to consider the length of your post-study work visa because nearly half of students would consider changing their destination based on that alone. And for institutions, we want you to keep in mind that after government websites, your websites are the second most used source of information about post-study work opportunities for students. So your websites should be accurate, they should be updated frequently to make sure that students have this critical information and can make an informed decision. And now, last but not least, this is our final section here from our Emerging Futures for Research, which is a survey taken on appearance. So this is exciting because the last time that we surveyed parents was in 2018. So exciting to dive into this really key audience again and gauge their latest attitudes. So first we asked parents, what are your biggest concerns around your child studying internationally? And we can see over here on the left that safety came out on top at 45%, followed by job prospects after graduation at 38%, living costs and tuition fees both showing up here as well, with over a third of parents indicating those as important, and finally distance from family and friends as well. We then asked parents, how is your child's international education being funded? And 71% said themselves, the parents, are paying for the education. 42% said they're relying on scholarships. 26% said they're taking out loans. 17% said relatives, and 11% said the child themselves will be self-funding their studies. So again, we see the importance there of the part-time work that students will be looking for if they will be funding their own studies. We then asked parents, how did you research the cost of living in your child's study destination, if at all? And interestingly, 44% said they relied on information from friends and family in the destination country for cost of living information. 43% said the destination government website. 42% said the institutional website. And then smaller percentages said agents or school advisors for this information. And lastly, because we're always asking students about their perceptions of destination countries, we also wanted to ask parents for their perceptions of the countries. And the results that we found were highly aligned with the perceptions of students. So some key highlights that we've pulled out here are that the US is viewed as the most expensive destination, that Australia has plenty of graduate employment opportunities, that Canada's post-study work policies are viewed as the most attractive, that the US offers the highest quality of education and is seen as the best value for money. So despite being perceived as the most expensive country, it is being viewed as worth the high cost. And finally, that the welfare of international students is considered the highest in Canada and Australia. So overall, we're seeing parent views are quite aligned with student perceptions. So what insights then can we take away about parents? Well, as we see, parents are the biggest source of funding for students' international education. So they're a very important audience to communicate with about costs. Students' safety and job prospects after graduation are the two biggest concerns for parents about their students studying overseas. And their perceptions of destination countries, as we just saw, are highly aligned with student perceptions. So some key actions for institutions to keep in mind in regard to parents are that they are a critical audience for you to be communicating with on promotional materials, your website, your brochures, because globally they are the financial source for students to study overseas. So definitely want to be communicating with them about finances, costs, and safety and job prospects as well, because clearly we see those are important. And at this point, I will pass it back to Rachel, who will give an overall summary for Emerging Futures 4.
Thanks, Ellie, and thanks everyone for sticking with us. I'm aware that we've just chucked a whole bunch of statistics and so much information at you. There's loads more actually though under the bonnet, as they say. So when you get your dashboards, please go in and have a look around. If there's any questions, get in touch with your client director or your client success manager. They are more than happy to help you show any of the insights that you want to dive into that are important to your institution. So based on what Ellie and I have discussed and based on some of the other stuff that we've not presented, the key insights, and again, not surprisingly, let's not rest on our laurels. A lot of destinations have got a lot of work to do to pull together to make sure that they're seen as still as an attractive study destination. If not, students will vote with their feet. We know that. Policy settings and communication have significant influence on attractiveness of a destination. And what we've seen is actually the two sides of that policy. Very important, obviously, there's been changes to policy, which mean that students can or can't bring dependents, for example, to the UK. But actually, even without a policy change, even just the rhetoric that can change within a government can have an impact on demand. So how do we counter that as a sector together? How do we work to counter some of the negative messages that might be coming out of governments in the UK, in Australia, in Canada, and in the US? I think the biggest challenge we definitely feel is the cost of living and how, and within that, we haven't spoken about individual markets, but some of the FX fluctuations that have happened in some of our source markets are having devastating effects on the ability to recruit. But cost of living generally will be a sustained challenge over the next 2 years. So our action is how aware are our students and how can we make them more aware of the financial implications of this and studying abroad? How aware are they of the housing market? Like Ellie presented, some want to wait till they get here to decide where they want to stay, and actually will that then have a negative impact on how much they can afford? And that practical support around post-study work so that they can actually afford to be in our study destinations. Again, not new information, but really acknowledging and supporting parents and guardians on their own guardian journey. Some universities do this really well. Some take the guardians and the parents on their own journey through conversion, and some do it in tandem with the students. Some don't do it at all. So acknowledging how much the parents and guardians want to be involved and the ability to get them involved through the channels that are best suited to those age groups and those audiences is really important. And immediate and practical actions to target marketing and recruitment. So I think there's been significant challenges for the September intake across the globe. We've noticed a lot of our partners coming to us and saying, what are we going to do for next year? We are not in the position we thought we'd be in. And it's about how do you take some of what you've heard today and some of what the sector is telling us around what's important for students and really build that into your messaging for the next recruitment cycle, which unbelievably we're already in. The recruitment cycle's already started for September 2024, and obviously January's open as well. That's our key insights. Thank you so much for being with us and listening. I don't know if actually the chat function doesn't seem to be working. Oh, look, we've got a question. Excellent. I thought the Q&A wasn't working, but it's just popped up. So Sophie's got a question. Do you have any suggestions on how universities can engage with parents apart from emailing, communicating with the parents and hoping they pass information on to their parents? I mean, I can answer that, Ellie, if you want to start with, and you can come in. But something that I've seen universities do really well is conversion events in market for parents. So when they're out in market with their pre-departure events or conversion events that are trying to speak to students, is having separate events for parents that are specifically designed for them. So the information varies, the delivery of the information varies. Often I've seen people do it with their student support teams rather than the recruitment team. So it's actually the people that will be there on the ground dealing with pastoral concerns, dealing with financial concerns. Have them in market, particularly in your recruitment, your popular recruitment markets, to really be at the coalface of answering those questions. And I think if you think back to some of the motivating factors behind parent choice or why they think the students should be choosing certain destinations, safety, security are really up there. So for them to be able to really tangibly see the people that will be looking after their children when they're at university, I think is really important. Easier said than done. Often these teams don't actually travel or necessarily want to, but I think sometimes when you do speak to those student support teams, they are happy to come to market because they realise the important role they can play, and also dispelling some myths or giving students some more information up front so that the problem doesn't necessarily arise when the student arrives on campus. Ellie, anything you want to add to that one?
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on. And one thing I'll add is that a former institution that I used to work at did a really nice job of collecting parent information and then using whatever social media platform was popular in that country. So for example, in Vietnam, we had a parents' Facebook group where the parents were super engaged and involved. So trying to get that parent information as early on, so long as they're opting into it, and then having a direct source, a direct way to send them information is a great approach as well.
There's another question here. What are the factors that make an institution attractive from the student's perspective?
Yes, well, as we see from our perceptions, there's a whole number of different reasons, but I think the main one that has emerged over the past few years is outcomes. So students are very interested in what their job opportunities are going to be post-graduation, what the post-study work visa is in the destination country, and will they be able to find a job? So we're seeing more and more that that's even taking precedence over rankings in many destination countries. Students just want to ensure that they have proper outcome and can secure employment upon graduation. So I think that's a really critical one to be communicating, along with all these other factors: cost of living, student support.
And we're seeing more and more actually to that answer too. And I think you're absolutely right, Ellie, but I think as well, we're seeing mental health support becoming more of a sort of, if universities have got good mental health support for students and good welfare support for students, we're seeing that as a really fundamental part of the sale and the sell as well, because people want to understand that they're going to go somewhere where if they do feel homesick or they do feel like they're struggling with the academic curriculum in a brand new country, there's an obvious signposting to people they can go and speak to. So there's lots of things that our research has shown, and there's lots of things just from having spoken to students that we know are really important as part of the student choice as well. But we also know that affordability is a massive part of it as well. And we know that students will choose universities that are maybe deemed to be, well, they're not deemed to be, they might be lower ranked or they might be lower down the kind of prestige level because they're more affordable. And because particularly in the UK and the US and Canada, because high quality is such a key part of what we deliver, the students don't really mind that they're picking a university that's lower ranked, because they're still getting a UK degree or a US degree from a great university, and they're able then to access the post-study work rights that come with that as well. So yeah, affordability is particularly individual source markets like Nigeria or India. We know that students are being driven by their wallets first and foremost.
Definitely, definitely. Next question that came in is, with decreased funding for travel and in-person recruitment, what are other recruitment strategies that could replace that?
I think that's a really interesting question. I don't want to be too IDP with the answer here, but obviously digital marketing is like a huge part of what we do as a business and what how our students are responding to what we do. So I think if you can't travel, how do you reach? And there's two answers, I suppose. There's digital marketing, and then making sure that's tailored and specific, and it's that you can track it well. So if you're generating leads, have you got the CRM to deal with them? Can you manage the leads that one of your campaigns may actually generate for you? If not, you can speak to your recruitment partners about how they could help you, and other recruitment partners are available. But obviously you speak to IDP about how we can help you with that. But I think the other thing as well is how much you can lean on your in-country staff if you're fortunate enough to have that model, because actually the in-country staff are your eyes and ears and your feet on the ground in those markets. So do you just delineate and say, okay, they're responsible for in-market activity, and we're responsible for making sure that we are at base looking at our data, analysing our data to see where the most likelihood is for conversion. And I was at a conference last week actually in the UK, and somebody on one of the panels was saying the role of the international office has kind of changed, and the role of the international officer has changed. We used to go out and pull up banners and sit at recruitment desks and speak to students in fairs, but actually that still happens, and it is really important. I've just done that recently for IDP, which was phenomenal in Nigeria, and seeing how students respond. But they're also responding to digital campaigns. They're responding to quick turnaround times in admissions, as Ellie spoke about. They're responding to good customer service. So I think if you can't spend, you can actually put a lot more in place at home to make sure that you are seen as a university of choice because of your customer service, and you are able to get your key messages through digital marketing to the right students in the right markets that help support any diversity agendas you have as well.
Absolutely. I agree.
Excellent. I think we've got off quite lightly there, Ellie, with questions. I feel like that's not that.
Did. Yeah,
it
yeah.
could have been worse.
Easy on us.
It could have been worse. But we're around. We're like, add us on LinkedIn. We're both on LinkedIn. We're both available for to answer any questions that you've seen today. You've all got a designated client director and client success manager through IDP, and we would love you to reach out to them with any questions you've got on how we can take this insight and make it relevant to your specific institution. Please just let us know how we can help you. But I would like to thank Ellie for your preparation for today, Ellie. Fantastic insights and contributions. Emma behind the scenes for making it all work and keeping us on track, which is fantastic. But also the IQ team and the marketing teams and the comms teams globally that pull together these insights. It's no mean feat to pull together responses from 10,000 students and make sure they're all validated. You will, as I said several times now, have access to all of that behind the scenes through my IDP Connect, but it's there for you. It's there for you to interrogate and for you to use. The reason we do it is to give you insights on how to work better as recruiters and as marketers. So please let us know if you've got any questions, and we'll see you at the next Emerging Futures 5 webinar. My goodness.
Exciting.
I know, very exciting, but thank you for your time, and I appreciate your attendance. Thank you so much.
Thanks all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.